first step of the 8 steps. You want to identify the need for a decision to be made. Now, this is surprisingly hard. I have a client who I do coaching for. About 3 weeks ago, we had a phone call. And what she was at that time experiencing is that, she's in a good position. She works for a large company. She makes 200,000. She's a manager. But she was kind of stuck in her position for a while already. And she's seeing that people are passing her onward who are who are younger than her. And so she's not happy with that. But she's just staying there. She likes the position. It's safe. It's comfortable. Now, she would stay there for a while, but at the same time, she's somewhat uncomfortable. And I asked her, hey, can you imagine what would be the case if you were here 5 years from now? And she had a very visceral negative response. If she just let things go along, she would still be there 5 years from now. I can pretty much guarantee it, because each month to month, when you think, oh, no, what's next month, it's hard to make the decision. Whereas if you think about all the time combined, that's when you feel the strong impetus that your values show that you need to make a decision.
Welcome to the Onward Podcast. This is your host, Emily Harmon. The Onward Podcast features authentic conversations about facing adversity and moving forward. And in each of these episodes, there are lessons that you can apply to your life as you move onward in the face of adversity. My guest today, Dr. Gleb Tsipursky, is a cognitive neuroscientist and an expert on behavioral economics and decision-making. As CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts, he spent over 2 decades consulting, coaching, and speaking, as well as training hundreds of clients across North America, Europe, and Australia. With over 15 years in academia, including 7 as a professor at Ohio State University, he published dozens of peer-reviewed pieces in academic journals, such as Behavior and Social Issues and the Journal of Social and Political Psychology. His thought leadership is featured in Fast Company, CBS News, Time, CNBC Inc. magazine, and elsewhere. And he authored the best-selling book, The Truth Seeker's Handbook. And his new book is Never Go With Your Gut: How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. Behavioral economics and cognitive neuroscience studies reveal that our flawed mental patterns, what scholars call cognitive biases, trigger the poor decisions at the root of countless business disasters. And that advice to go with your gut is actually a strategic error that costs organizations and careers. In this interview, we discuss many practical examples of cognitive biases and how leaders and organizations can overcome these biases. We also talk about which practices help organizations avert catastrophe. I hope you like the interview. Gleb, welcome to the Onward Podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Emily. It's a pleasure to be on.
I'm really excited to interview you. You've written this book called Never Go With Your Gut. And this podcast is called Onward. It's about overcoming adversity, how we move onward after some challenges in our lives. And I think that you're saying that by listening to our gut, we're sometimes creating some challenges in our lives, be making better decisions.
That's exactly right. And a lot of people cause themselves a lot of problems by doing what they feel is right, instead of thinking through and actually doing the right thing for themselves.
How do you know if you're going with what you feel or if you're thinking it through?
Well, a lot of people just don't think it through. They just feel something is right, and then they do it. Actually, if you don't mind me sharing a story from my parents, the reason I got into this, or the fascination, was based on my parents. My parents were very much in this mold of, I feel it, therefore it's right. And the large majority of the population is in this mode. I feel something, therefore it is the right thing. And so my parents, unfortunately, felt different things were right compared to each other.
Okay, they didn't get along.
They did not get along, and they both felt that they were right. Just like the majority of people do vast majority of people do when they feel they're right, they feel that other people are wrong who don't feel the same way. So
feel is this key word that's going through your
yes, it is. Yes. And we can talk about emotions later. But so what happened with my parents, so I'm giving you a couple of examples just in the financial, because that's where a lot of the conflicts were. My mom liked nice clothing, so she'd go out and buy a $50 sweater. And my dad was kind of a cheapskate. So she'd come back home and, he'd yell saying that, no sweater should be worth over $20. So stuff like that. So they had these sorts of conflicts, which boiled over into other larger conflicts. But the biggest one was this one time. So my dad was no prize. He worked as a real estate agent and he worked based on commission, so a variable salary. There was about a 6-month period where he made a lot of money, but he hid it from my mom and told her he made very little money. And then he bought an apartment on the side, rented it out to some people. In a couple of years, my mom found out and she was very mad. She was very pissed. There was this huge, big blowout fight and they actually separated for a while. So I ended up living with my mom separately from my dad. And the previous conflicts obviously impacted me as a kid, when I already saw my parents fighting over dumb stuff that they shouldn't be fighting about. But this one was really bad because, I didn't see my dad for a long time. I mean, they eventually reconciled, but she could never really trust him again. So seeing that happen with my parents made me realize that my parents aren't gods and adults make bad decisions all the time. That made me fascinated with decision making. How do we make our decisions? Especially how do we make decisions badly? Because most of us make decisions very badly. And we can go into that. So that gave me the impetus to study decision making and how our minds are screwed up and cause us to make really bad decisions because we're not adapted for the modern world in decision making. Our gut intuitions are actually not adapted for the modern. And that is a big problem with people who go for their gut. They feel a certain thing is right, but their feelings are not adapted for modernity.
What would your dad have done differently if he didn't go with his gut?
Oh, my dad would have thought through the consequences of what happens if he hid to the money and my mom finds out. I mean, the answer is obvious. She'll be very pissed. But he didn't think through the consequences. He felt that he was doing the right thing for himself and for the family. Somehow it went through his head. I don't know what he was thinking exactly. He probably wasn't thinking. He just felt like it was the right thing to do to hide the money and then buy a house elsewhere. Maybe he felt that my mom would want the money spent on, nice clothing and she would spend it on quote unquote the wrong things. And so he hid it. And of course, he didn't think about the results of him hiding it for the relationship.
In the heat of the moment, how do you know if you're making a decision based on your gut, or how do you know if you're making a good decision? Like, how do you do that?
Well, that's what the book is about. Never go with your gut, how pioneering leaders make the best decisions and avoid business disasters. It's a whole book about that. So you want to dig into it, one by one and figure it out. So there's no one quick way to answer it. But the best way to know that you're not going with your gut and that you're making the right decision is to make sure that you follow a clear decision-making process that's based on the research on how we make good decisions. Because, again, we're not adapted for the modern environment. So our feelings are often going to lead us astray. And let me make sure I'm clarifying what I mean by adapted. I actually mean in the evolutionary sense. Very clear, scientific, adapted standard. Our feelings, our gut reactions, our instincts, our intuitions, whatever you call it, are adapted not for the modern environment, whether business, life, politics. They're adapted for the savanna environment. When we lived in small tribes of 15 people to 150 people, we're hunters, foragers, gatherers, whatever, and that's what they're adapted for. So we are adapted to eat whenever we come across a source of sugar. We're adapted to eat as much of it as possible because those of our ancestors who did that were the ones who survived and thrived. So we now have their genes because all the others died. So right now, when we come across a source of sugar, we want to eat as much of it as possible. That's terrible. Yeah, that's terrible in the modern environment. When Dunkin' Donuts or Krispy Kreme sells you donuts by a dozen and so many others sell you a lot of food because they make a lot of money from you eating a lot of sugar. That's bad for us. That's terrible for us. That's the reason for the obesity epidemic that we're experiencing. But our gut reactions, they tell us to do this. They tell us to eat as much sugar as possible. You have to work hard to stop and not eat a dozen donuts when you have a dozen donuts in front of you. One donut is okay, maybe two. Going into the third donut is too much. But how many people eat a dozen donuts when they have the box in front of them? Very many. So that's a big problem. Now, that's just one example. Of course, we have much bigger problems in our decision-making than eating a dozen donuts. Another big one from that environment is the tribalism. So we are inbuilt to be tribal. That means we are inbuilt to like people who think like us, who look like us, who have our beliefs and values. In the savanna environment, it was crucial to be tribal to survive. If we were kicked out of our tribe, we'd die. And if our tribe fell apart because we weren't sufficiently supportive or conformist to authority and to our tribal members, to social norms, we would die. So we're built to be tribal. That means that in the current environment, we have a number of problems where we are not in a tribal environment. We're in a very complex, multicultural, multipolar environment. But we still are very tempted to look at people and judge them based on whether they fit into our tribe or not. We're still very tempted to conform to authority and to social norms in ways that are damaging to our society. So that's one big set of problems where the dangerous judgment errors that I talk about in my book come from, called cognitive biases. Now, another set of dangerous judgment errors that come from the tribe, from the ancestral environment, is going to come from the fight or flight response. The fight or flight response was very important in the savanna environment. It was really important for us to jump at 100 shadows to get away from that one saber-toothed tiger. You might have heard of it as the saber-toothed tiger response, or to fight an attacking tribal member. But in the modern environment, you'll notice there are many less saber-toothed tigers.
Right.
Still, we
haven't
react.
Yet.
Yes, we still react to threats as though they're saber-toothed tigers. And we are very tempted to make very quick defensive or aggressive responses that are not going to consider the actual consequences of our actions. And we're going to go based on our feelings as opposed to having thought things through. Now, in the current environment, when you have a bus barreling at you, you don't want to take the time to think it through. You want to take the time to do the defensive response or the aggressive response or whatever. But the vast majority of decisions in our environment are not like the savanna environment. So you want to take the time to stop, think it through, and make the best decisions. But that's not what our gut tells us to do.
Right. So I just retired from working for the military, and we would have a good approach, but you addressed it in some of this material that you sent me to prepare for this interview. We would do an assessment of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And when we're doing some strategic planning and thinking through. So that when you're doing that assessment of SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, and doing some strategic planning, then you're not going with your gut. Is that right?
Yes, you're definitely improving on the gut reactions, on basic gut, feelings. But you're still falling into some dangerous judgment errors. Just like we talked about a little bit before the program in the military, what tends to happen when people go for the SWOT analysis and many other strategic analysis is when they don't account for the dangerous judgment errors, cognitive biases that we'll experience, is they tend to be too optimistic and too confident, like the military procurement specialists and their providers, defense contractors that you and I discussed before the show.
Right. What we were talking about there is, sometimes, my opinion, I was a contracting officer, sometimes program managers, and this is very generic, but you're running a program like maybe a helicopter program or a fighter program, and you've got limited money, you've got all these challenges. Sometimes I think it's human nature to tend to be optimistic about what it's going to take to overcome those challenges and plan for the best case scenario when really the worst case scenario or something a little worse than that best case scenario might happen. And then that gets the program behind. So just tend to be optimistic in our thoughts about how we can quickly move this program forward. That's human nature, right?
And what you're talking about, human nature, is what I'm talking about with gut reactions and intuitions. Yes, that is human nature. It is a natural thing. It's the primitive, savage, primal thing. It's what the Tony Robbins of the world say, be primal, be savage, be optimistic. Well, that's not what works in the modern environment. These are people who are selling you snake oil. This is not the thing that actually, they tell you the things that will get them paid well. Tony Robbins and Malcolm Gladwell, who tells you to blink, it pays them well, but it's not actually what will work. It pays the contractors, program managers well to be optimistic, to say, yay, everything will be great. But the consequence of that is that programs will be left behind, resources will be misallocated, and you'll have serious problems for your organization, whether you're the military, whether you're a large or small company, and whatnot. So with this strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats analysis, what I tend to overwhelmingly see as a big problem is that people list too many strengths, too many opportunities, not nearly enough weaknesses, not nearly enough threats because of this optimism bias. And as a result, naturally, they misallocate resources and they make serious mistakes going forward. And then risks come up and bite them on the buttocks.
It's really important for a leader, also to be able to let other people speak when you're doing that SWOT analysis and not just dismiss the recommendations of other people on the team. That's a natural reaction too. And it just because maybe you don't think that way, somebody else brings up a problem to just say, oh, that's not really a problem.
Yeah, this is definitely an important thing for leaders to do. Leaders actually tend to be much more optimistic than most leaders. So if you look at the leadership roles, the CEO and so on, most leaders tend to be too optimistic. Partially, it helps them get to the leadership role. They project confidence, they project strength, and it helps them become leaders. But what they need to do is understand that they tend to be too optimistic. They need to understand their weaknesses. They need to understand their flaws. They need to understand where their own cognitive biases are. And all of us are prone to some extent to cognitive biases. And we need to understand what are our own cognitive biases. So, for example, optimism bias is a big one for me. I tend to think that things will be great when sometimes they won't be. I tend to have too high expectations of other people, of myself, of my projects. I tend to think the grass is green on the other side of the hill, whereas it's too often yellow. And this is a big problem. I know this about myself. So whenever I do projects, whenever I do significant activities, I make sure to run my ideas by pessimists, people who are risk averse, people who think the grass is yellow on the other side of the hill when it's sometimes green. So having that feedback from those people and listening to it seriously and making sure to incorporate it into my plans really helps me address a lot of problems going forward, helps me become a realistic optimist. Whereas
I recommend that somebody, it seems like very introspective. You've done a lot of study on this, so you know what your tendencies are. What about somebody who may not know what their tendencies are? How do they figure that out?
Well, the key thing is for them to study cognitive biases, learn about them. There are over 100 cognitive biases. You can go on the Wikipedia list of cognitive biases. You'll find over 100 of them. You can read about them. Now, my book, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, goes for the 30 most dangerous cognitive biases in professional settings, whether it's for your career, for your business, whatever you're working on, and helps you address them. It has an assessment in the end. Chapter 7 goes for an assessment that helps you understand which cognitive biases are the most powerful and impactful for you, for your workplace, for your team. So, for example, question 1 asks, in your workplace, how many projects in the past year have gone over time or over budget as a percentage of all projects? So when I pose that to a group of professionals, I hear answers ranging from 5% to, 3 weeks ago, I heard 98%. And, 5%, that's not a big deal. 10%, that's not a big deal. When you're getting into the 30s, that becomes more of a serious issue. Getting into the 50s, that's really bad. And 98%, woof, that's pretty terrible.
Who said that, though? Was it a pessimist?
98%?
That said 98, or was it?
No. It was just a leader, just kind of realistically assessing what's going on. So that's something that you need to understand. And that's 1 out of 30. So there are 29 others. And you want to understand which ones are most impactful and present for you so that you can address them. So optimism bias will be one for me. The one with the planning that I just talked about, over time and over budget, that's the planning fallacy, where we tend to think that everything will go according to plan. And there are so many others that I'll be happy to go into if we want to do that. So there are lots of cognitive biases that you need to be aware of which ones are most powerful for you so that you can watch out for them. And then the book talks about specific steps that you can take both to address each individual cognitive bias. So I tend to be optimistic, I make sure to run my ideas by pessimists. And that is one way out of several to address the pessimism, to address the optimism bias. And there are ways of addressing the planning fallacy, which I can go into. And there are also two techniques in the book that are described to go and address a number of cognitive biases at once through integrating these as a part of your decision-making process. But the first thing, of course, is to have awareness, to understand what's going on, be aware.
Yeah, and that's really important too when you're picking your team. Like you said, you'll seek out a pessimist, somebody who's different than you, to give their opinion. So if you're picking people for your team that are all like you, your tribe is everyone's just like you, looks like you, acts like you, then that can lead to some overwhelming challenges.
Yes, this is one of the biggest problems in hiring, actually, for entrepreneurs. Now, it's a well-known statistic that about half of all startups fail within the first 5 years, about 2/3 fail within the first 10 years, and about 75% fail within the first 15 years. And this comes from the Small Business Administration. So, this is very, very clear data about the statistics on failure. And a lot of that failure comes because entrepreneurs, startup founders, make decisions based on their gut reactions. And one of the biggest decisions they make based on their gut reactions is who they hire. So who are the first early people they hire? They hire people. They're not experienced in hiring. They're just starting out their business, right? Mm-hmm. So they hire people they're comfortable with, who they click with. And they click with people who are like them. Optimists hire optimists, pessimists hire pessimists, and so on. This is a huge problem because if you have a bunch of optimists together, you'll have people who have 20 ideas before breakfast, and they think that all of these ideas are brilliant. And I say that as someone who has 20 ideas before breakfast and thinks they're all brilliant. So I know what I'm talking about.
You speak from experience.
Exactly. The problem is I know they're not all brilliant. I have learned rationally, not with my gut reactions, that they're not all brilliant. So the most effective thing for me to do is to take these 20 ideas, give up ownership of them, and give them to a pessimist who I have in my firm that I run, company that I run, Disaster Avoidance Expert, 6 people, pessimist, give it to the pessimist and say, hey, here are my 20 ideas. What do you think? And the pessimist goes through them and says, these 3 ideas, they all have baked potatoes. These 3 potatoes, maybe they're worth finishing baking. And then the pessimists are terrible at generating ideas, but they're brilliant at improving ideas. They can see exaggerated flaws, and then they can correct the flaws. Here are ways to correct the flaws. So that's a much better way for pessimists and optimists to collaborate together. So that is a specific technique that you can use. You're welcome to use it in your company. But then to do that, you need to hire pessimists and have them as part of your team. And you need to.
I can't afford to hire anybody for my company right now. It's just me. So I'll have to play pessimist and optimist for a while.
Well, I'm sure you can find a friend with whom you can exchange services.
Yes, I'm sure. So give us some examples of some recent things that have happened in the news that you attribute to making decisions based on gut, like some companies that have had some challenges.
Let's go with optimism since we're pursuing that. So look at what happened with Dennis Muilenburg from Boeing. So Boeing, obviously, from folks who have been in the cave, had a major series of accidents with the 737 MAX crashing twice, with 346 people being killed. I think Boeing had over $20 billion of value it already took. And of course, there'll be many more costs going forward that are not accounted for, that 20 billion, where the trust is lost, reputation is lost. So if you look at what happened, Boeing CEO at the time, when the 737 MAX crashes happened, was Dennis Muilenburg. And in March of 2019, Boeing 737 MAX planes were grounded. Dennis said that, we'll be flying them by May. May was approaching. No, it wasn't happening. So he said, we'll be flying them by July. July was approaching, not happening. He said, we'll be flying them in September. September was coming up, not happening. He said, definitely by December. And December was happening. He said, we'll be flying them by March. And the board fired him. The board specifically said that they fired him for his excessively optimistic predictions on when the 737 MAX would be flying, because that caused a lot of resource loss and costs and reputation costs, and of course resource costs, because you make your plans according to when you think the 737 MAX will be flying. So that cost Boeing quite a bit more in terms of reputation and money than simply the grounding of the 737 MAX. The perception that Boeing was not doing a sufficient job and going through the steps of evaluating what needed to be fixed with the 737 MAX. So that's an example of where optimism bias cost many billions of dollars and cost a very prominent CEO his job.
Wow. Yeah, for sure. So what's another example that you've seen lately in the news about that?
Well, one good example is the WeWork debacle. So WeWork was worth about, in the start of 2019, it was valued about maybe $75 billion, something like that. And then it decided to go forward with its IPO. And its IPO, the initial public offering, Adam Neumann, the leader of WeWork, said, hey, everything will be great. People will be very happy, and we'll go forward and we will do the initial public offering to raise money. Unfortunately, other people had very different perspectives on how the company should be run compared to Adam Neumann. He suffered from a cognitive bias called a false consensus effect, where he thought other people would be more like him and share his perspective compared to the reality of the situation. The governance structure of the company had some serious problems. For example, he had shares that were worth 10 votes each, and he was giving out shares that were worth 1 vote each, and other sorts of issues that resulted in Adam Neumann having a lot of control over the company. Now, what investors wanted as part of the IPO is to have control over the company, not simply invest into it, but to have control. And the eventual valuation of the company, as a result of their lack of trust, that and a number of other factors resulted in investors losing trust in Adam Neumann and the company's leadership. And the company's valuation was so high in part because they trusted his strategy, they trusted his leadership. Once they looked at the books, once they looked at the structure, and the loss of trust in the leadership resulted in the valuation going way down. Finally, the IPO didn't happen, and the valuation was brought down of the company to around 7.5 billion. Now, that's a difference of an order of magnitude from 75 billion to 7.5 billion, over $60 billion lost because of this false consensus effect, because of making unwarranted assumptions about what other people are thinking.
Yeah, going with their gut.
Exactly. He very much went with his gut.
Not asking, maybe because you don't really want to know what other people are thinking. I don't know why they're not asking. So very, very interesting. What cognitive biases do you feel are you already addressed what your vulnerabilities are with cognitive biases. So how do you adjust for that day to day, besides just talking to somebody who's a pessimist on big decisions? What else do you do? What other tips do you have that you employ?
So for me, there is a decision-making strategy that I use and that all of my clients use that address a number of cognitive biases at once. But separately from that, we can talk about that in a bit. Separately from that, things I do is I notice that I make sure to understand that I tend to be excessively optimistic. And knowing that I tend to be excessively optimistic, I try to calibrate for my optimism. So if I think that, hey, I think that the client will pay me $15,000 for a training, then I say, okay, now that's likely to be too optimistic. So even if I feel that the client will pay $15,000, it's most likely that the client will go to $10,000 and they won't be able to pay more than $10,000. So I need to be ready to negotiate effectively and not be shocked when the client says, I can't afford that. How much less can you do? So something like that has to be part of the negotiation. I have to understand that, hey, I have to have lower expectations about the client. That's one thing. Another thing is about staff members. Oh, that's always a hassle. So where there are so many projects that I can do better than a number of staff members. I have 6 staff members at my company. And I have to be okay with staff members doing them worse. That feels very bad. It feels very bad for me to let go and delegate projects, which I know I can do better. I'm confident I can do better. And I have to feel that, hey, maybe I can do better. And I have too high expectations of other people. They are not in my position. They don't have my expertise. They don't have my knowledge. There's a cognitive bias specifically called curse of knowledge, where people who have more knowledge about a topic forget about how difficult it is to actually learn how to do something and practice and get experience with it, especially soft skills that aren't technical hard skills. Now, soft skills involve so much learning, so much efforts that we don't even like reading other people, listening actively, and so on. Talk about that for a while. I did training on this.
I remember when I was working with the Navy, we'd have people come into my office on rotation. And a lot of times it would be easier for me to do the job myself or for the other employees to do the job themselves. But the reason these people were on rotation is so that they can learn. And if you're not going to give them the project to let them learn, then why even have them there? That's how people learn. So that's something I noticed. And another thing is I noticed that there would be times when I really don't like working with a ton of data, doing spreadsheets and analyzing it all, not my thing. So I had a woman on my team that would do that. And sometimes I'd ask her for an answer to something that I thought she could just spit out in a second. But then I can see her head thinking, her mind going, and she's thinking, but if I do that, then I've got to do this, and I've got to do that. And really what I was asking was so much more complex than I thought. And I had to make sure that I was able to listen to her and get her feedback about that so that I could give her more time.
Yes.
Because I just didn't realize how much time it would take to do something.
And that's a very important analysis and realization that you had. And there are some people who would never make that analysis, never make that realization, and they feel frustrated and resentful and disappointed with their staff.
Right. Yeah.
And that's something that one has to realize. And that's something that, again, I learned and that I had to address within myself as an optimist.
Yeah. Yeah. So you have an 8-step decision-making model.
That's right. So it's one of the two models that I talk about of how do you address a lot of cognitive biases at once in your decisions. So one of these is the 8-step decision-making model. This is for important, serious decisions, whether in the military, where you want to make a major commitment to a project, whether in your personal life, that you want to, let's say, move to a new place or, I don't know, get married or something like that, change your careers. In business, you want to launch a new business or launch a serious new product or choose a critical supplier. This is the process that you would take. It takes you for 8 steps, takes about an hour to do. And there's a separate process that uses 5 questions, much quicker, 2 minutes. That one's meant to minimize risks, get you to a good enough answer. This one is meant to get you to the most perfect answer possible within the reasonable time that you have available. So, first step of the 8 steps, you want to identify the need for a decision to be made. Now, this is surprisingly hard. I have a client who I was coaching, who I do coaching for. About 3 weeks ago, we had a phone call. And what she was at that time experiencing is that, she's in a good position. She works for a large company. She makes 200,000. She's a manager. But she was kind of stuck in her position for a while already. And she's seeing that people are passing her onward who are younger than her. And so she's not happy with that. But she's just staying there. She likes the position. It's safe. It's comfortable. Now, she would stay there for a while, but at the same time, she's somewhat uncomfortable. And I asked her, hey, can you imagine what would be the case if you were here 5 years from now? And she had a very visceral negative response to it. She's like, no, totally can't imagine that,
That means a decision does need to be made, is what you're saying.
Exactly. Decision does need to be made. That's right. But if she just let things go along, she would still be there 5 years from now. I can pretty much guarantee it, because each month to month, when you think, what's next month, it's hard to make the decision. Whereas if you think about all the time combined, that's when you feel the strong impetus that your values show that you need to make a decision. So that's one example of where you need to identify the need for a decision to be made. And it really helps to look at the 5-year outlook or the 10-year outlook to see where you want to be 5 to 10 years from now. Next, you want to gather relevant information on a topic from a variety of perspectives, especially people who disagree with you. So I'd go to pessimists and make sure I get their perspective. Pessimists should go to optimists and get their perspective. In general, go to people who disagree with you. You don't have to listen to them, but you should hear them. So you should hear them out and incorporate that information into your decision-making process. Then decide on your goals. Paint a clear vision of the outcome. What do you want to do? Let's say you're moving to a new place, you're moving to a new house, to a new city. What do you want your life to be like? Are you just moving because you don't like where you are currently? That may not be the best reason to move, and that may not be the best way to actually make the best decision about what place you want to live. Have a clear vision of the kind of life you want to be like and the kind of activities you want to be doing, and that will help you choose the right place to move to.
I'm thinking as we go through this model that I'm doing this with my daughter right now. So
okay.
She's living with somebody in the basement of a house, and they want to move out. They're tired of living in the basement, and she has some money that she can buy a house. And she feels like buying this house, she found her dream house, right? That's a good decision. But then I'm asking her, I'm second guessing. I guess I'm being the pessimist. Why do you need to move? Why couldn't you stay there and you don't have rent for a while, save up some money? Why is it that you need to move? Why do you like the house? Why was the well just some changes to the well made in 2018? Have you thought through, is it in a floodplain? All these things that somebody might not look into if they're just going at their gut, like, I love that house.
Yes.
Right? I mean,
yep. Yes, that's very important to realize. And so many people do choose a house because they love that house. And, it has a lovely backyard. And I happened to see during that time of year when it was early fall and the leaves were beautiful. And,
or they fell on the ground. Yeah,
exactly. They don't think about the rest of the year. Sure, your leaves will be beautiful for, 2 weeks. But what will the rest of the year be like, right?
Uh-huh.
So that's something that people don't think about. We tend to ignore information that we don't have, and we look at information that we do have. And I think you're being very wise in helping her and realize, hey, what information are you not looking at? So she doesn't have a clear vision of what she doesn't know. And that's one of the typical big mistakes, that we don't know what we don't know and we don't look for it. Whereas if we do look for it, that's the step to gather relevant information from a variety of perspectives. And then as part of that, the next step is painting a clear vision of the desired outcome.
I do give her credit. She's listening to different people's opinions, which is really
excellent.
Good. So
that is very good.
The next one is what, number 4?
That's not right. You want to develop clear decision-making criteria to evaluate your options. So let's say you have let's say you want to move to a new house. So what is the cost of the house? Obviously, that's consideration. What is the age of the house, kind of repair and so on? What is the location? Is the location convenient for you? Is the house size sufficient for you? House feel, whatever criteria you have. So develop criteria for everything, for all the relevant aspects of your decision, everything that's significant, and then weigh them. So compare the costs to the location, to whatever. Let's say cost is not that significant for you because you have quite a bit of money. Let's say that's the case. So you want to, on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is low, 10 is high, you say cost is a 5 for you. But location is incredibly important because you really want to have walking distance to work. So then you put the location at a 9 or 10. And then you want to, let's say, the neighborhood feel and safety and so on. That's going to be quite important to you, not as important as location. You put that at a 7. So you have criteria and you weigh them compared to each other. Then you develop viable options. It's not a good thing for your daughter to only consider one house. Right. There might be better places out there. There might be, and this is one of the biggest problems for significant decisions. People tend to satisfice for significant decisions, meaning look for the first viable options, settle, and move onward. That's really bad for critical decisions, because critical decisions, major ones, really have a very big continuing impact on your life. So you really want to think about whether you want to satisfy, and you generally don't in big decisions. And that's why I strongly recommend generating at least 5 viable options, whether it's for buying a house, city that you want to move to, employee that you want to hire for a critical position, new product that you want to launch, potential businesses that you want to launch, and so on. Then weigh the options, picking the best of the bunch. So again, if a house has a certain amount of cost, compare that to other houses. So let's say houses mid-range. You have one expensive, one that's higher, and one that's in the middle. And then you want to weigh them based on location, based on cost, based on all of these things, how they compare to each other, and pick the best. Next, step 7, implement the option you chose. And as part of the implementation, there are 2 steps to make sure that you maximize the likelihood of a good outcome, minimize the likelihood of a bad one. So to minimize the likelihood of a bad one, you want to imagine that this decision, whatever you're going through, that it completely failed. So absolutely failed, and you want to imagine why. So let's say with this house, maybe it failed because it has a crack in the foundation, and you haven't looked at it sufficiently, or it has some termites, and you haven't done a termite inspection, which is separate, completely separate from a regular inspection, as I learned when my in-laws had a serious termite issue, whether they didn't inspect. So that was bad.
That down. Talk to my daughter about that. All right, go ahead.
Yes, exactly. So that's something to think about. Then you can address that by having an inspection, obviously. So you want to think about all the ways that you can fix potential problems. Having a $200 inspection to ensure that your $200,000 purchase isn't screwed up. Right. That's a very wise decision, investment. Then what you want to do is maximize success. So how would this decision be maximally successful for you, more than you imagine? Perhaps you'll find that the neighborhood is very friendly. Let's say that you have really nice neighbors, everything is great. So you want to find that out. You want to see what kind of neighbors you have, and whether they're nice and friendly or not. And then you want to weigh that and make that part of your decision-making process. Then, next, it comes the last step, 8th step. Evaluate the implementation process and revise as needed. So you want to make sure that you are not stuck with your decision. You want to make sure that you measure the quality of your decision and you change it over time. So for example, when you're buying the house, let's say you got a contract and so on. If you discover things about the house that are bad, you want to make sure to update your beliefs about the house and the quality of the house. A lot of discoveries will let you get out of the contract if you discover crack in the foundation or whatever. And you want to decide, how serious is this problem? How much does it impact your desire to buy the house? Maybe you can negotiate with the current homeowner and say, hey, you will fix this leaky roof as part of the contract deal, or I will not buy a house, or give me some money to fix the roof, for example. So you want to make sure to incorporate revisions into your plan, measurements and revisions into your plan as you go forward to maximize success and minimize problems. So that's the 8-step process for making major decisions.
Or what if you're at work, think with businesses nowadays and the way the world is, things just move so fast. How do you make sure you have time to go through this 8-step decision-making process?
Well, you have two things. You want to think about, so for crucial decisions, you definitely want to use that. There's a separate decision-making process for casual, quick decisions, which we can talk about. But for this step, what I want to highlight is that it's going to be so much more costly for you if you don't go for it. Now imagine you don't go through the process and you discover that you have termites, right? So how much is that going to cost you in terms of money and time? It's going to cost you, it cost my in-laws, many, many, many days to take care of it, and several $1,000s when they had to actually address it. So that's not something you want to spend. If you can address it in advance, you want to make sure to do that.
Right, definitely. I think before we get into your other thing on quick decision-making processes, I would say that the way the retail environment is set up now, it's set up for us to make decisions based on our gut, because I do that a lot when I go into Target. Actually, now that I moved into a rural county here in Virginia after I retired, I don't have a Target nearby. But when I used to go to Target all the time, I would make a lot of decisions with my gut. Buying stuff, and they, like Valentine's Day, whatever, they put the things right up in front. So you just make these gut decisions. I think in the back of my mind, I know that I can always return it if I don't want it. So that's something good. But I think that retailers take advantage of our tendency to make decisions based on our gut.
They absolutely do. And retailers are very skilled. Salespeople do that all the time. Retailers do it all the time. Car companies are especially good at it, apparently, from the research. So what they do is when you're buying a car and you're thinking, okay, this is a good car, and you're looking at the package, what kind of specific model and make to get. They start your decision-making process with really minor decisions like, color, whatever, things that don't cost much.
Right.
By the time you get to the larger things, like, the kind of engine, the power warranty, and lots of things that are going to be very expensive. You're pretty tired. You're suffering from what's called decision fatigue. When we make a lot of decisions at the same time, we suffer from decision fatigue. We get tired and low energy. And then the salespeople, because we're low energy, we're more able to be influenced by external forces like salespeople who are able to pitch us on attractive options that we feel are attractive. We'd be able to resist them more if we had more energy, but we're drained. And so then they cause us to, come home and discover we spent $700 more on the car than we needed to because the salesperson was able to pitch us on something that we really didn't need.
That's how they get you in timeshares.
Yes, it's a good example. Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, you just have to listen to this 1-hour spiel. I won't let myself go in and listen to that 1-hour spiel because I'm just scared of what could happen.
Yep, exactly. So that's what you want to avoid. You want to avoid putting yourself in that position.
Yep. So tell us about your other decision-making process.
Sure. So this is for satisficing. When you want to not screw up a decision, minimize risks without maximizing rewards. This is for, let's say you want to write an important email to a client, professional colleague, whatever. You're preparing for a meeting. You are going to buy a car and you want to prevent yourself from making a dumb decision. You want to do something that's not really major, huge, but everyday decisions that you don't want to screw up. So 5 questions that you want to ask yourself before making any decision. It takes a couple of minutes to ask them. First, what information didn't I yet fully consider? You want to especially look for information that goes against your beliefs, that goes against your intuitions. We suffer from a bias called the confirmation bias, where we tend to look for information that confirms our beliefs, like looking at the beautiful backyard of the house, and ignore information that doesn't, like, seeing that it has a very bad bathroom or something like that, or a kitchen that would have to be ripped out and replaced anew if you can survive in this house. Right. So that's the kind of things that you don't look at. Or for a potential hire, you don't look at some of their holes in their resume and don't ask them about it. Those are things that you want to make sure to go against your comfort zone. All the things that we do with our gut intuitions, They are things where we stay in our comfort zone, where it's comfortable by definition. And you want to make sure to go outside of your comfort zone and ask these difficult questions, confront this negative information. Because if you can prove to yourself that you don't have, that this information is not going to disprove your preferred choice, that's great. It's more likely that you're making the right choice. But if it's going to show you that you're wrong, you also want to very much have that information because it'll help you make the better choice.
Yes. Definitely.
Next, what dangerous judgment errors haven't I yet fully considered? So again, we have over 100 dangerous judgment errors, cognitive biases that we suffer from. You can take a look at the list on Wikipedia or my book, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, looks at the 30 most dangerous ones in professional settings. Next, what would a trusted and objective advisor tell you to do? What would your mom tell you to do about buying a house, right?
Yeah.
What would that little angel on your shoulder tell you to do? You get about 50% of the benefit from this by just asking the questions. You can step outside of yourself. Think about what would you tell a friend to do in this situation. And you get the other 50% of the benefit by calling this person, or if you're a millennial, texting this person.
Right.
Fourth, how have I addressed all the ways this could fail? It's similar to step 7 on the larger process, but it doesn't address success. It just addresses failure because it's good enough to avoid the problems. So same way, if let's say you're writing an important email, think about what would happen if the person reading it, let's say a client, is in a bad mood and they take a hostile interpretation of it. And it's hard to read tone in an email, right? So in order to address that, read the email as though it's being read from a hostile perspective and revise it to remove all ambiguity and make sure that you convey information in a very clear, straightforward manner. It's hard to do, but it's important to do that. So that's a way that you would address failure. And finally, what new information would cause you to change your mind? So what would cause you to revise your decision? It's hard for us to revise a decision once we made it because we're emotionally attached to it. So think in advance. What would cause you to change your mind? So let's say you're writing an email to a client, important email, and you decide if you don't get a response from a client within 7 days, within a week, you will call your client. You'll give your client a call. Now, if you don't make that decision in advance, you'll be spending those whatever time just biting your fingernails, deciding how can you respond to your client not responding to the email. What do you do about it? But if you have a clear decision-making point and you say, okay, in a week, I will call my client. If I don't hear from them, you can just calm down and go onward with your day, do other things.
Yep, that makes sense. I can think of situations where I wished I had applied that. Okay, you went through all the steps, right?
I did. That was all 5 steps.
So one of the things I was thinking about is you were talking about, because you're you're an optimist, that you're thinking, I think I could get 50K for this task from my client. And you have to be realistic and think, well, maybe 10K is more realistic. I'm in a lot of groups where people are starting their online businesses and they're all worried about, how much to charge. And I think the problem, at least I see happening more often, is people undercharging or thinking I'm not worth the 50K and just asking for 1K when really they could probably make 10K. So there's a lot of, and maybe it's just for women, but there's a lot of classes that I see online where, they're teaching you to, value what you're worth and ask for what you're worth.
Women more often tend to be pessimists than men. It is based on our evolutionary heritage. So think about the evolutionary environment. Men were the fighters. So we're hunters and gatherers that was fighting hostile tribes. Men had to be confident and optimistic that they wouldn't die when they're facing hostile tribes. Otherwise your tribe wouldn't survive because the men would go and hide with the women, right? Right. So men, because of the testosterone, testosterone increases optimism, increases aggressiveness, optimism, and so on. So men are naturally, just because of that, more optimistic, and women tend to be more pessimistic. So women more often tend to undervalue what they're worth, and men tend to overvalue.
That's very interesting. So yeah, that explains why I've seen a lot of classes being offered on that. So yeah. Well, how can people find you if they want to learn more?
My book is available in bookstores everywhere. So it's published by a great traditional business publisher called Career Press. So Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. And of course, it's available online everywhere, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and everywhere else as well. My information, videos, blogs, podcasts, guides, manuals, decision aids, classes, consulting, coaching, teaching, is on disasteravoidanceexperts.com. Again, disasteravoidanceexperts.com. You want to especially check out a free 8-video-based module course on wise decision making, the Wise Decision Maker course. It's going to be at disasteravoidanceexperts.com/subscribe. Again, 8 video-based modules, disasteravoidanceexperts.com/subscribe. And finally, I'm very active on LinkedIn. So if you have any questions about anything you've heard on this podcast, please go on LinkedIn, connect with me there and ask me. Dr. Gleb Tsipursky, GlebTsipursky.
I think this is going to be really helpful. I can see how this would be very helpful for entrepreneurs. In my last job, I was the director of the small business office for the Navy and Marine Corps. I dealt a lot with entrepreneurs, and I see these challenges come up where, maybe they're making decisions with their gut. They're really too emotionally attached to the product that they've invented, and they need to listen to other people's opinions or questions about that product. I can see looking at this book and even as a company, maybe having people read, like a leadership team or people in the company read it and then go to an offsite and kind of discuss it and discuss how these biases are impacting their company and how they can make better decisions.
Well, yeah, that's what I mentioned with the trainings versus, 15,000 versus 10,000. That's the kind of trainings I do, whole day retreats or 2-day retreats.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Emily. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Gleb. So perhaps this interview helped you think back at some of the decisions you've made. I know it did for me, and realize that some of them were probably more based on my feelings and my gut than going through an actual decision-making process. I liked Gleb's advice about having optimists as well as pessimists on your team and making sure that you run decisions, especially key decisions, by both. And that doesn't mean you have to take their advice, but it does expose you to areas where you may have blind spots. So I really enjoyed this interview. I hope you did too. If you hear any noise in the background, as I record this, I'm visiting my son and his family, and I'm helping my grandson, who's 4, do online preschool. And I want to say that I commend all of the parents out there that are struggling with working from home and making sure their children get the education that they need. I know Marshall's only 4, and it's not as big of a deal that he misses out on some of the school year this year. But for kids in high school, college, elementary school, they're all important. And it's so hard learning online. I just participated in an online class, and I don't know how the teacher does it. She has some students in the classroom and some are at home. These are 4 and 5-year-olds. So, their attention span is not really there. And because she's in the classroom, she's having to wear a mask as she teaches. So it's really hard to follow her lips when she talks on the screen. When you see her on the screen, it's just, I don't know where to describe it. It's insane. And I really hope that we can all get back to some semblance of normalcy soon. And I just hold a special place in my heart for every parent, every teacher, every child that's going through this right now. I, for one, can say I didn't really appreciate it until I experienced it myself. I want to give a quick shout out to my new Onward Accelerator coaching program. And I would say this coaching program is not for parents who have little ones at home and you're trying to work and get them through school. This is not for you. This coaching program is more for people that are about my age, probably in their 50s, with kids in college perhaps, that have just kind of looked up and realized, wow, I'm entering a new phase of life. Who am I? What do I want to achieve in my next phase? I'm not ready to necessarily retire and sit in a rocking chair, but now I'm able to focus on myself. I've spent a lot of time focusing on raising a family and putting my needs last, which is understandable. But now I'm ready to focus on myself and what do I want? That's who this coaching program is for. I'm not saying that others can't participate in it, but I'm just saying now that I've been through teaching at home just for like an hour, I recognize that I don't know how you would do this coaching program on top of everything else. but you're more than welcome. If you want to learn more about it, just send me an email, emily@emilyharmon.com, and put in the subject line Onward Accelerator Program, or message me on Facebook or LinkedIn. We kick off the group program on October 26th, that week. So there's still time to sign up. And then the individual one-on-one program, you can participate in that starting anytime. So anyway, I hope to hear from you. And if you don't have time for that, just simply join the Onward movement. I think you'll find a positive reception. You'll love the posts. It's encouraging what people post every day and the support that we give one another. Right now, the Onward movement is mostly in the Facebook group. And I hope that once we get back to some semblance of normal, we can have some retreats and get to know one another in person, because we sure are getting to know one another online. That's for sure. All right. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you for listening.